My days, before the letter, were a tapestry woven from the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic tap of a keyboard. I was Dean, a creature of habit, whose greatest adventure was navigating the crowded morning commute. My apartment, a precise arrangement of functional furniture, echoed the quiet order of my life. There was a comfort in its predictability, a soothing balm against the larger, messier world. I liked things neat, explicable, devoid of the inconvenient tangles of history or the whispers of the unseen. Then came the envelope, thick and cream-colored, bearing a wax seal that felt anachronistic in my mail slot. It spoke of solicitors, of an estate, and of a distant relative, a great aunt I barely remembered, whose name was a faded echo in the periphery of family lore. Her passing, the letter stated, had been unsettling. A peculiar choice of word, I thought, for something as inevitable as death. The inheritance. Blackwood Manor. A name that tasted of dust and forgotten things, nestled deep within the Appalachian mountains. My initial reaction was a scoff, a dismissal of what sounded like a Gothic novel plot. Ancestral homes and mysterious deaths were not part of my carefully curated reality. But the details, relayed by a crisp-voiced solicitor over a staticky phone line, were undeniable. The property was mine. The weight of that fact settled upon me, a foreign, unwelcome burden. Skepticism was my shield, a well-honed tool against anything that threatened to disrupt the placid surface of my existence. Local legends, the solicitor had vaguely hinted, were plentiful. I pictured quaint superstitions, harmless tales spun by isolated communities. A minor inconvenience, I reasoned, easily ignored. The journey began with the familiar rumble of jet engines, a comforting sound of progress and distance. But as I peeled away from the structured grid of city life, the familiar began to fray. There was a layover, a protracted wait in an empty airport concourse with motionless escalators. The silence was vast, punctuated only by the distant, disembodied announcements that seemed to echo from nowhere. The polished floors reflected the sterile glow of overhead lights, creating an endless, shimmering tunnel. I walked its length, my footsteps surprisingly loud. A lone figure in a space built for multitudes, a ghost in a machine that had ceased its function. The stillness of the escalators, their metal teeth locked in perpetual ascent, felt less like a temporary halt and more like a permanent cessation, a silent promise of no return. It was a liminal space, a pause between the world I knew and the one I was being drawn into, and a faint, cold tendril of unease began to coil in my gut. The final leg of the journey was by rental car, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than a dirt track that clawed its way up the mountain. The air grew thicker, cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I stopped for fuel in a hamlet so small it barely registered on my GPS. The gas station attendant, a man whose face was etched with the lines of hard living and quiet observation, eyed my city clothes with a slow, appraising gaze. Blackwood Manor, you say? His voice was a low rasp, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He paused, the nozzle still in my tank, and I felt the weight of his stare. That old place. It's got a way about it. Best not to go stirring things up, young Dean. He didn't elaborate, simply pulled the nozzle free with a soft click and took my money, his eyes holding a depth I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't a warning, not exactly, but a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet certainty that unsettled me more than any shouted admonition. As I drove on, the woods pressed in, their branches weaving a dense canopy that swallowed the last vestiges of daylight. My skepticism, once an impenetrable fortress, began to develop hairline fractures. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, I saw it. Blackwood Manor. It sat on a rise, silhouetted against a bruised twilight sky, a skeletal hand reaching for the heavens. The house was not merely old. It was a monument to decay, a testament to neglect. Strips of paint peeled from its vast, timbered facade, resembling flaking skin. The porch sagged, its railing splintered, and the overgrown gardens were a tangle of thorny bushes and wild, grasping vines that seemed to actively consume the structure. The house did not simply exist. It brooded. It held its secrets close, wrapped in the cloak of its own slow disintegration. The air around it felt heavy, thick with unspoken stories, with the echoes of lives long past and perhaps not entirely gone. My rational mind, my determined skepticism, fought against the rising tide of sensation. It's just an old house, I told myself, neglected, falling apart. The inheritance was not just a property. It was an invitation, and I had a terrifying premonition that I was about to pay its long overdue dues. The air within Blackwood Manor was a stagnant shroud, thick with the scent of forgotten dust and the slow, metallic tang of decay. It clung to my clothes, seeped into my skin, a pervasive perfume of entropy. Light, thin and jaundiced, bled through leaded windows webbed with grime, painting skeletal patterns across the warped floorboards. My footsteps, usually so muted, echoed with an unnerving resonance, each creak and groan of the ancient timbers a conspiratorial whisper. The journey here had been a blur of increasingly desolate landscapes, each mile pulling me further from the structured hum of my former life. The silence there had been absolute, a hollow drum in my ears, broken only by the distant, mournful sigh of the ventilation system. It was a premonition, I now realized, of the profound, consuming quiet that awaited me here. That concourse, with its hushed potential and abandoned promise, had mirrored the skeletal grandeur of this house, both vast, beautiful, and utterly devoid of life. My initial determination, a fragile shield against the unknown, began to fray at the edges. My exploration began in earnest, a methodical pilgrimage through its cavernous chambers. Each room offered a fresh tableau of slow ruin. The drawing room, swathed in sheets that billowed like pale ghosts, held a piano with yellowed keys, a silent testament to melodies long since lost to the mountain winds. In the library, shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound volumes, their pages brittle, their knowledge locked away in a crypt of forgotten lore. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp paper and dormant mildew. I moved through the echoing spaces, my breath a shallow, audible thing in the profound quiet. An old house, especially one this vast, was bound to groan and sigh. It was simply the physics of decay, the slow surrender of timber to gravity and time. Its architecture was a perplexing labyrinth of styles, as if generations had added wings and turrets without a cohesive plan, creating a patchwork of stone and wood that defied logic. A faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, began to prick at my senses, subtle at first, then growing more insistent, especially near the older central sections of the manor. In what I presumed was a study, a massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface scored with countless scratches, its drawers stiff with age. I pulled at one, then another, the wood protesting with a dry, rasping groan. Most were empty, save for a few desiccated leaves or a forgotten thimble. But the third drawer down on the right side resisted, stuck fast. My fingers brushed against a rough, unvarnished panel. Curiosity, a dangerous siren, pulled me forward. I prized the panel free, my nails scraping against the raw wood. It was not the elegant, decorative carving I'd seen elsewhere in the house, but something older, cruder, imbued with a strange, almost unsettling energy. The faint, sweet smell was strongest here, clinging to the box like a shroud. This was a reveal, a tangible fragment of the house's hidden life, something deliberately concealed. I lifted the box, its weight surprisingly substantial. The wood felt unnervingly warm against my skin. What secrets did it hold? What forgotten ritual did these symbols represent? I spun around, expecting an open window, but the heavy glass panes remained firmly shut. My heart, which I'd tried to keep steady, began a subtle, insistent thrum against my ribs. Yet the unease was no longer a distant hum. It was a rising crescendo, a dissonant chord struck deep within me. The house, I realized, was not merely settling. It was watching. And it was waiting. I had spent days battling this decay, my determination a brittle shield against the encroaching gloom. Each scraped floorboard, each wiped pane of glass, felt like a small victory. Yet the house seemed to absorb my efforts, its hunger for disrepair insatiable. It began subtly, an insidious crawl beneath the surface of my awareness. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across distant stone, would sometimes brush the edge of my hearing. I would pause, hammer suspended, listening to the profound silence that followed, always concluding it was the wind or the ancient timbers settling. I dismissed it as a draft from a poorly sealed window, a trick of the old house. One evening, as twilight bled into the vast windows of the library, I was cataloging some of the water-damaged tomes. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, perched on the mantelpiece, shifted. Not a tremor, not a fall, but a deliberate, almost imperceptible turn, as if its tiny head had swiveled to face me. My breath hitched. I stared, my eyes straining in the dim light. It sat inert, just as before, its painted eyes fixed on the empty hearth. My mind raced, conjuring explanations, vibrations from my movements, an unseen current of air. But the room was still, the air unmoving. Later that night, sleep offered no true escape. I found myself adrift in a landscape of polished floors and echoing vastness. The air hummed with a silent, expectant tension. No distant rumble of jets, no hurried footsteps, just the profound quiet of abandonment. I called out, my voice swallowed by the immense space, leaving only a lingering sense of my own insignificance. The following morning, the anomalies escalated. I was in the dining room, wiping away decades of grime from a mahogany sideboard. A heavy silver-framed portrait, depicting a stern-faced ancestor whose gaze seemed to follow me, slid an inch across the polished surface. I watched it happen, my hand frozen. There was no tremor in the floor, no jostle. It simply moved, with a soft, almost deliberate scrape. I began to see things in the periphery of my vision. I would whirl, my senses on high alert, only to find nothing but the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, constant murmur that made the very structure feel alive, watchful. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, a need to understand, or perhaps simply to confront, I started to explore the manor with a new intensity. My focus shifted from restoration to investigation. I tapped walls, peered into forgotten corners, and pushed against stubborn panels. My search led me to a narrow, unused passage behind the main staircase, a space I had initially dismissed as a utility shaft. At its end, obscured by years of cobwebs and a layer of plaster that seemed newer than the surrounding wall, was a faint seam. My fingers traced it, feeling the rough edges, the slight give. It had no handle, no visible latch. I ran my hand over its surface, my fingers brushing against faint, raised patterns. They were not decorative carvings, but symbols, strange and angular, unlike anything I had ever seen. They hummed faintly beneath my touch, a vibration I felt more in my bones than in my skin. A shiver, profound and visceral, coursed through me. This was not a hidden pantry or a forgotten closet. This was something else. This was a secret, deliberately sealed away. With a deep, shuddering breath, I pressed harder against the panel, searching for a mechanism. My thumb grazed a specific intersection of the symbols, and with a soft, almost imperceptible click, the panel receded inward by a fraction of an inch, then swung silently open. The air that spilled out was ancient, heavy, and tasted of loam and something else, something acrid and metallic. My skepticism, once a sturdy anchor, had been severed. I was no longer merely restoring a house. I was unearthing its very heart, and it was watching me. Sleep had become a fractured, treacherous thing, a landscape of shifting shadows and whispers that coiled around my thoughts, even after the first pale tendrils of dawn pierced the grimy windows. I woke with a gasp, my throat raw, the phantom chill of a dream wind still raising gooseflesh on my arms. In that dream, the manor's walls had breathed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, each exhale carrying a sigh that was almost a name. And then, a sound, the dry rustle of something moving within the plaster. A scuttling that grew in volume until it filled my ears, not with the frantic skitter of vermin, but with a deliberate, creeping approach. The memory lingered, a viscous film coating my waking mind. It was just fatigue, I told myself. The strain of sleepless nights and the daunting task of this house. My eyes played tricks, yet the doubt had taken root. The paranoia was a growing parasite, burrowing deeper with each passing hour. I started checking doors repeatedly, even though I knew them to be locked. I had to get out, even for a few hours. I needed to see other faces, hear other voices, feel the solid, undeniable press of a world that wasn't Blackwood Manor. I grabbed my keys, the familiar weight in my palm a small comfort, and headed for the front door. My old sedan, dusty but reliable, sat waiting. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key. I tried again. Nothing. A dry, rasping grind. I pumped the gas, tried once more, the mechanical groan sounding increasingly pathetic, desperate. It had been fine yesterday. I had driven it into town for supplies. There was no reason for this. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, the leather cool against my forehead, and for a long moment, I simply breathed in the faint scent of gasoline and old upholstery, trying to steady the frantic beat of my heart. When I looked up, the world outside the windshield had subtly shifted. The familiar expanse of overgrown lawn and ancient trees was gone. Instead, I was staring out at a vast, desolate space, bathed in an artificial, sickly yellow light that hummed with a low, almost inaudible thrum. No people, no luggage, no announcements. The escalators, twin ribbons of metal and rubber, stood frozen, their teeth bared, leading nowhere. Up or down, the path was equally impassable. I pressed my hands against the cool glass of the windshield, my breath fogging the surface. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing hard, willing the image away. When I opened them, the concourse remained, stretching into an impossible distance. I wasn't just trapped in the house. I was trapped within my own mind. The car door felt heavy as I pushed it open, stepping out onto the strangely resilient, almost springy surface of the concourse floor. This place, designed for movement, for transition, was utterly still, utterly dead. The house, I realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just a place I inhabited. It was a living, malevolent entity that had begun to inhabit me. It wasn't content to merely watch or to decay around me. It was actively dismantling my perceptions, weaving its own terrifying reality into the fabric of my consciousness. The entity wasn't just external. It had found a way in, a way to erode the very foundations of my sanity. The house had swallowed me whole, and now it was digesting my mind, piece by agonizing piece. Days blurred into a single, relentless vigil. My fingers, stained with the grime of ages, sifted through brittle ledgers in the library's gloom, their pages like dried leaves, whispering forgotten names. The only sound, apart from the groan of the house itself, was the rasp of paper against paper, a dry, insistent chatter echoing my own frantic thoughts. I found journals bound in sun-faded leather, their script elegant but often maddeningly obscure, full of archaic phrases and veiled references to the old ways and the land's due. Each entry, a fragmented shard of a shattered mirror, reflected only glimpses of a deeper, more monstrous image. The smell of mildew and dried ink became my constant companion. My eyes ached, tracing lines of faded script by the grudging light of a single lantern. The house itself seemed to resist my efforts, the floorboards groaning as if in protest, the windows rattling with phantom winds even on the stillest nights. It was a pressure on my skull, a hum beneath the floorboards, a knowing stillness in the air that tightened around me with each revelation. I discovered references to a specific ancestor, a man named Elias Blackwood, whose entries grew increasingly erratic, his elegant hand devolving into a frantic scrawl. He spoke of a ritual, performed not in the manor itself, in a place of unveiling, a threshold between what is and what must be. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fractured thing, a descent into a landscape far removed from Blackwood Manor's suffocating embrace, somehow intrinsically linked. The absence of sound, of movement, was a profound weight. It felt like a place where journeys began but never ended, a transit point to nowhere. The stillness was not peaceful. It was predatory, waiting. The journals continued their slow surrender of truth. Elias Blackwood, driven by ambition and a desperate desire to secure his lineage's prosperity, had performed a forbidden ritual. It wasn't a pact with a demon in the conventional sense, but a binding. He had not offered blood, not directly, but something far more insidious. A piece of the very fabric of his family's future, a claim on the spiritual essence of his descendants. The entity, whatever it was not merely tied to the land. It was interwoven with the Blackwood bloodline, a parasitic presence sustained by generations. The monstrous act was the manipulation of a natural ley line, a vein of primordial energy that pulsed beneath the Appalachian earth. Elias had diverted it, forcing it through the heart of Blackwood Manor, but not without consequence. To stabilize this immense power, he had to offer a tether, a living conduit. And that conduit was not just his own life, but the inherent vitality of his future kin. It knows our names, and it demands its due. The last branch of the tree. It will be the strongest, the ripest, the true unveiling. The last branch. I was the last branch. The entity wasn't just haunting the house, it was haunting me. I wasn't just an heir to a decaying estate. I was the final installment of a centuries-old debt. My ancestors hadn't just built a house, they had built a cage, and I, unknowingly, had stepped inside. It was the ancient, hungry thing, patiently waiting for its final, most potent meal. And it was me. The realization, a leaden anchor in my gut, had festered through the night. I was not merely an occupant, a temporary steward of this decaying monument. I was the final thread, the last offering, a debt to be collected. I tried to regain a semblance of control, to impose order on the chaos that threatened to consume my mind. A book, a heavy tome on Appalachian folklore I'd been consulting, suddenly launched itself from a high shelf in the library, striking the opposite wall with a concussive thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Pages fluttered down like startled birds, settling around the splintered spine. My breath hitched. It was no draft, no settling of old wood. This was deliberate. This was force. A low, guttural groan rumbled from the floor beneath my feet. Not the settling of timbers, but a sound like a vast, unseen beast shifting its weight. The air around me plummeted in temperature, a sudden, icy fist clenching my lungs. I stumbled backward, my hand instinctively flying to my chest, as if to ward off an invisible blow. Then, the doors began to slam. First, the heavy oak door of the drawing room, a deafening report that echoed through the entire wing. The house was not just decaying. It was actively hostile, a living, breathing maw preparing to swallow me whole. The very walls seemed to undulate, the patterns in the ancient wallpaper blurring, swirling into something malevolent. Suddenly, the world fractured. There was no sound, no distant hum of machinery, no voices. Just the sterile, dead air and the silent, unmoving metal teeth of the escalators stretching upwards into an unseen ceiling. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Was this a dream? A faint, acrid scent, like ozone mixed with something metallic, stung my nostrils. I spun, searching for an exit, a sign, anything. But the concourse stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of glass and steel leading nowhere. It was followed by a crushing pressure, an invisible hand pressing down on my shoulders, forcing me to my knees. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick and suffocating, as if the very atmosphere of this barren place was trying to crush the life from me. I gasped, fighting for breath, my vision blurring at the edges. I strained, muscles screaming, but I could not move. It was as if a mountain had settled upon my chest, pressing the air from my lungs. A sharp, searing pain tore across my forearm. When the weight finally, agonizingly lifted, I scrambled to my feet, my arm throbbing. 3 raw, angry parallel lines, still weeping crimson, marred my skin. They were deep, precise, as if drawn by claws, not a random scrape. This thing, this ancient, demanding entity, was not content with tormenting my mind. It sought to break my body, to claim me physically. I stumbled towards the nearest door, desperate for a moment's reprieve, a space to breathe. But the heavy oak refused to budge. I shoved, I pulled, I rattled the ornate handle, but it was locked fast, though I knew it had been open moments before. I moved to another, then another. Each door was an unyielding barrier, a silent, mocking refusal. The house had sealed itself around me. It was no longer a structure of wood and stone. It was a cage, and I, the last branch, was its captive. The entity was not just present. It was everywhere, within the walls, within the air, within me. A pervasive, malevolent force that had finally chosen to reveal its true, horrifying nature. The air itself seemed to thicken with this knowledge, pressing in on me, whispering of ancient claims. A cold, gray light bled through the grimy panes of the library windows, painting the dust motes in the air like suspended particles of dread. My phone, a useless brick in my hand, showed no signal, a blank screen mirroring my own growing emptiness. I had tried every outlet, every corner of the house, even venturing onto the rain-slicked porch, holding it aloft like a desperate prayer. Nothing. The landline, its cord thick with generations of grime, was equally silent, a dead weight against my ear. The internet, a luxury I hadn't truly missed until now, was a distant memory. The manor had swallowed every thread of connection to the world beyond its skeletal trees. A frantic energy seized me. I tried the front door first, its heavy oak scarred with time and neglect. It felt as though something vast and invisible had settled against it from the outside, a monumental weight that defied all my strength. I threw my shoulder against it again and again, the dull thud echoing through the silent house, a testament to my futile efforts. Splinters bit into my skin, a minor sting against the deeper ache of panic. Next, the back door, leading to the overgrown gardens. It too was sealed, the ancient bolts rusted into place, or perhaps fused by something more insidious. I moved from room to room, a ghost in my own impending tomb, testing every window. Most were painted shut, the sashes swollen with moisture and age. Those that did offer a sliver of movement were barred from the outside, thick iron rods set deep into the stone, an architectural feature I had dismissed as merely aesthetic until this moment. They were cages, not decorations. My mind, a frantic bird, fluttered towards the garage, towards the old pickup truck I had driven up here. A sliver of hope, quickly extinguished. The garage door, a vast sheet of corrugated metal, had collapsed inward, twisted and gnarled as if by some immense, unseen hand. The truck, half buried beneath the rubble, was a forlorn wreck, its tires deflated, its windshield cracked like a spiderweb. Even if I could have cleared the debris, the road leading down the mountain had been swallowed by a recent landslide, a fresh scar of raw earth and broken timber that I had observed on my way up, dismissing it as a temporary inconvenience. Now it was an impassable barrier, an accomplice in my confinement. I was trapped. Truly, irrevocably trapped. The air grew heavy, suffocating, laden with a scent I now recognized as damp earth and ancient iron, a metallic tang that spoke of old blood. It was then, as I stood amidst the ruins of my last hope, that the house exhaled. A sudden, jarring shift in my perception. I was no longer in Blackwood Manor, but standing in an immense, echoing space. The vast, vaulted ceiling stretched into a gray nothingness. The floor a polished expanse reflecting the dim, diffused light from colossal windows. Rows of empty seats, sleek and modern, sat abandoned, gathering a fine layer of dust. The escalators, twin ribbons of metal, stood frozen, their teeth bared, leading nowhere but into the silent air above. No distant hum of engines, no disembodied voice over a speaker, no scurry of hurried footsteps. This was the ultimate non-place. A portal to anywhere that had ceased to function. A cruel mockery of escape. You see, Dean? The thought was not my own, yet it resonated deep within my skull. A voice like the grinding of tectonic plates, ancient and patient. There is no going back, no going forward, only here, only us. The concourse rippled, the edges of the vision blurring, and I was back in the decaying hall, gasping, my hands pressed to my temples. The entity was not just in the house, it was the house, and it was reaching into the very architecture of my mind. Your blood remembers, Dean. It sings the old songs, the agreements made when the earth was young and the trees first clawed at the sky. Your forebears, they understood the price of power, the cost of solace in these wild lands. A tithe, a stewardship. My family, the inheritors of this cursed legacy, had not merely lived here. They had been bound, generation after generation, to something unspeakably ancient, something that now demanded its ultimate due. I was not an owner. I was the final sacrifice. A wave of profound despair washed over me, heavy and suffocating. Hope, a fragile thing, had been systematically stripped away, piece by agonizing piece, leaving behind only the stark, desolate landscape of my entrapment. The entity's goal was clear: to consume, to integrate, to make me a part of its endless hunger. My sanity, my very existence, was merely the next course, and there was nowhere left to run. The last word, ultimatum, had not truly ended, but hung in the air, a bell tolling within the hollow chambers of my skull. My family, I understood now, were not merely caretakers of a legacy, but anchors in a chain, each link forged in fear and blood, connecting them to an entity whose hunger transcended generations. The knowledge tasted of ash and rust, bitter on my tongue. Then the walls of the study, the dusty tomes, the flickering lamplight, all dissolved like smoke. The air thinned, growing cold, and a strange, anachronistic vision seized me. The vast space stretched before me, a cathedral of glass and steel, bathed in an unnatural twilight that bled through the arched windows. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The floor, a mosaic of chipped tiles, reflected the wan light like still water. To my right, the motionless escalators rose like twin staircases to an unseen upper level, their metal teeth bared and unmoving, promising a journey that would never begin. Each step was a silent, mocking invitation, a path to nowhere. I walked, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished floor, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the immensity of the space. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, not purely from fear, but from a desperate growing comprehension. This was not a physical place, but a construct of memory, a psychic canvas upon which the ancient entity chose to paint its truths. This was the intersection of my modern mind and its primordial demands. As I neared the base of the escalators, faint, translucent images began to shimmer into existence, like heat haze rising from asphalt. I saw a man, gaunt and wild-eyed, his clothes centuries out of fashion, kneeling before a crude altar. His hands, gnarled and trembling, offered a small, blood-slicked bundle. Then another, a woman this time, her face a mask of sorrow, carving symbols into the bark of a twisted tree. Generation after generation, each ancestor, a link in the chain, appearing and fading in the spectral light. The revelation struck me then, not as words, but as a visceral understanding, a direct download into my consciousness. The entity did not demand sacrifice in the conventional sense, not merely blood or life. It demanded sustenance. It fed on the emotional residue of the living, the fear, the sorrow, the despair, the very essence of human experience. And the pact, the terrible ancient pact, was not for protection, but for perpetuation. My ancestors had not just lived here. They had been tasked with ensuring a steady stream of these potent emotions, tethering souls to the manor, keeping the entity satiated. They had become its shepherds, its farmers of suffering. The motionless escalators now seemed to mock me, representing the ascent and descent of generations, each one delivering their quota of misery. And now, the last thread of that line was me. As the spectral images shifted, I saw a woman, her face obscured, but her posture defiant. He was not offering, but hiding something, a small, intricate carving tucked away, almost an afterthought, beneath a loose stone. It was a symbol, not of appeasement, but of containment. A counter-ritual? A forgotten weakness? The entity thrived on being acknowledged, on being fed. The pact wasn't unbreakable. It was simply unbroken. My ancestors, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of a twisted sense of duty, had continued the cycle. But this woman, this forgotten ancestor, had seen a way out. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the motionless escalators, a sound that started in the very ground and ascended into my teeth, a vibration of immense power and ancient displeasure. The spectral figures flickered, their silent suffering momentarily giving way to distorted grimaces aimed at me. I gripped my hands into fists, my knuckles white, but beneath it, a strange, grim determination solidified. I was Dean, the last inheritor of this cursed bloodline, and I had also seen the faint, almost imperceptible crack in its armor, left by an ancestor who had dared to dream of an end. The burden was mine, yes, but so too was the choice, to perpetuate or to break. I retreated into the library, the scent of decaying leather and forgotten dust, a thin comfort against the cold dread that gnawed at my vitals. The old journals lay scattered, open to cryptic passages and crude sketches. My eyes traced lines of faded ink, seeking not just understanding, but a weapon. The entity demanded its due, yes, but even a predator has its vulnerabilities, its blind spots. I had to find them, before I became another forgotten name in its long ledger of consumption. The vast, vaulted ceiling stretched into a hazy, indefinite distance. The light a uniform, pallid glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. I walked, my footsteps unnaturally loud, across the expanse of the concourse. They promised ascent, departure, but offered only stasis. It was a space of transition without motion, of expectation without fulfillment. Images flickered at the periphery of my vision. Ancestors, their faces drawn and haunted, performing strange rites in flickering candlelight. It was not a symbol of protection, I realized with a sudden jolt, but of binding. The entity was not merely haunting the house. It was tethered to it, trapped within its walls by the same bloodline that had inadvertently given it power. The ultimatum was not a release, but a threat to sever the last threads of its confinement, to unleash it completely. The air in the concourse grew heavy, the distant pallid light seeming to dim. I understood. The house was the anchor, and its decay was loosening the chains. My family had not simply built Blackwood Manor. They had built a prison, one that was now crumbling, and the entity knew it. The key lay in the manor itself, in the very materials and architecture designed to contain it. I rose, my body heavy, but my mind alight with a terrifying resolve. My plan began to form, a desperate, dangerous gamble. It required not just courage, but a deep, unsettling plunge into the arcane. I needed to reinforce the binding, to reforge the chains. And for that, I needed specific components. My first task led me to the manor's forgotten corners, to the dusty, cobwebbed cellars beneath the kitchen. There, among stacks of rotting crates and forgotten tools, I found what I sought. A small, tarnished iron box, its lock rusted shut. With a pry bar, I forced it open, revealing a collection of strange items. Dried herbs, their scent still faintly pungent, a small, chipped obsidian knife, and a coil of thin, braided horsehair. These were not just trinkets. They were components, each imbued with a purpose I was only now beginning to grasp. Next, I descended into the deepest part of the manor, a section I had only glimpsed, the ancient, damp underground bunker beneath the oldest wing. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic and acrid. Here, I searched for the specific structural weaknesses, the places where the binding had frayed most. My fingers traced intricate carvings on a low archway, symbols identical to the stylized knot I had seen in my vision. This was a focal point, a point of power and of vulnerability. I spent the next hours meticulously preparing. I used it to carve new lines into the crumbling mortar of the archway, reinforcing the ancient symbols. The braided horsehair I carefully unwound, then rewove it with strands of my own hair, a sickening sense of personal sacrifice settling over me. The dried herbs, crushed to a fine powder, I mixed with a handful of earth from the bunker floor, creating a paste that I smeared along the carved lines, the scent filling the confined space. As I worked, the manor seemed to respond. A low, resonant hum began to even vibrate through the stone, not unlike the sound of the ultimatum in my skull. It was a growl, a warning. The entity knew. It sensed my intent, my defiance. My hands trembled, but my resolve hardened. There was no turning back. I was no longer merely a victim. I was a combatant, armed with a desperate plan, preparing for a battle that would decide not just my fate, but perhaps the fate of Blackwood Manor itself. The word ultimatum had not truly ended, but hung in the air, a bell tolling within the hollow chambers of my skull. My family, I understood, had made a bargain centuries ago, a pact sealed in the earth and the bloodline, and now the ledger demanded balancing. I was the final entry. My plan, born in the shuddering silence of the hidden library, was a desperate defiance. I would not pay. I would sever the cord, even if it meant tearing a piece of myself away forever. The air thickened, sweet and cloying like overripe fruit, then brittle and sharp as shattered glass. The walls of the study, laden with the dusty ghosts of ancestors, began to stretch, their patterns blurring into impossible geometries. One breath, and Blackwood Manor was gone. I stood not on aged floorboards, but upon an expanse of polished, unforgiving tile, reflecting a sickly, pallid light from overhead panels. It was a place of transit, stripped of its purpose, a purgatory of departure and arrival. This was its final stage, its ultimate trap. The entity had dragged me into its own twisted reflection of liminality. It was not merely the temperature of the air, but the absence of warmth, of life, of hope. My determination, however, was a stubborn ember, refusing to be extinguished. I clutched the heavy, iron-bound book to my chest. The ancestral grimoire, its pages brittle with forgotten truths. This was the weapon, the shield, the key. You want to claim me, as you claim the others, but I am not them. A low thrum vibrated through the floor, a sound that began deep beneath the tiles and rose, slow and deliberate into the air. The fluorescent lights above flickered, not in a random dance, but in a rhythmic pulse, like a slow, malevolent heartbeat. They drifted, like smoke, towards me. I opened the book, my fingers tracing the archaic script. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, not of blood, but of will. It demanded a severing. I began to chant, the words foreign on my tongue, yet imbued with an ancient power that resonated deep within my own blood. As I spoke, the concourse began to writhe. The polished floor seemed to ripple, the reflections of the light stretching and distorting. The motionless escalators groaned, their metal teeth seeming to clench, their silent ascent now an unbearable beckoning climb into nothingness. Each word I uttered felt like tearing a ligament, a profound strain on my very core. My own memories flickered, images of my childhood, of my family, twisting into grotesque parodies. I saw my reflection in the slick tiles, not my own face, but a gaunt, withered visage, eyes sunken, skin like parchment, the face of one already consumed. This was the entity's true face, I realized, not a single form, but a collective of all it had devoured, all it had twisted. It fed on the fear, on the surrender. The book glowed faintly in my hands, a steady, defiant light against the encroaching gloom. The final verse of the ritual required a direct confrontation, a declaration of severing. I raised my voice, forcing the words out, each one a hammer blow against the entity's hold. I reclaim what is mine, I roared, the sound raw and ragged. I sever the tie, the bargain is broken. The concourse screamed, not with a sound, but with an impossible, bone-jarring vibration. The ceiling panels cracked, showering phantom dust. The motionless escalators began to vibrate, a low, grinding growl emanating from their depths, threatening to lurch into motion and consume me. I felt my own will fraying, a thin thread stretched to its absolute limit. But then, a counterforce. As my will wavered, a surge of defiant energy, primal and fierce, erupted from deep within me, fueled by generations of ancestors who had fought, failed, and perhaps even hoped for this moment. The energy pulsed outwards, a wave of pure, concentrated defiance. The concourse flickered, its sterile white walls momentarily replaced by the rough-hewn stone of the manor's cellar, then back again. The entity was recoiling, its hold momentarily broken. It was the absence of everything, seeking to fill itself with me. With a final, desperate surge of will, I completed the ritual, slamming the book shut. A blinding, silent flash erupted, not of light, but of pure, crushing force. The empty airport concourse with motionless escalators shuddered violently, then fractured, like a mirror struck by an invisible hammer. The ultimatum had been met. The battle, though silent and unseen, had been fought. But whether I had won, or merely delayed the inevitable, I could not yet say. The shadowy fiend, not a form of flesh or bone, but a tear in the very fabric of perception, lunged. It was a gaping maw of absolute absence, a void that drank the light from the empty airport concourse with motionless escalators, pulling at the threads of my being. The impossible vibration intensified, rattling my teeth, churning my stomach. The ceiling panels, already fractured, shrieked as they warped, shedding a fine gray dust that tasted of forgotten things and ancient sorrow. The escalators, silent and unmoving moments before, now pulsed with a low, guttural thrum, a sound that resonated not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones, threatening to drag me into their grinding depths. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic tang of old blood and the cloying sweetness of decay. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating quiet. It wasn't a ward, but an invitation, a binding, a conduit, and I, Dean, by my very presence, by my bloodline, was the key. My ancestors hadn't just lived there, they had fed it, willingly or not, and in doing so had become extensions of its will, its consciousness. I was not just an heir, I was the culmination, the final potent vessel. The concourse was not a gateway from the manor, but a manifestation of it, of the entity's desperate grasp. My determination, however, had calcified into something hard and unyielding. I would not break here, in this purgatorial waiting room. The escalators groaned louder, their metal teeth chattering, threatening to become active, to swallow me whole. I knew, with a horrifying clarity, that if it consumed me here, it would not be a physical death, but an absorption, a permanent melding with the ancient malevolence. My consciousness merely another facet of its endless hunger. I raised my hand, not in surrender, but in a gesture I instinctively understood. It was the motion I had seen in a faded drawing hidden in the manor's forgotten library, a ritualistic ward against an unseen force, but also, I now realized, a binding. I wasn't warding it off. I was severing the connection, the conduit that was me. It was an act of pure will, a refusal to be devoured, a violent rejection of my inherited fate. The cost, I knew even then, would be immense. The concourse shrieked again, a sound of pure agony, but this time it was the entity's pain, not mine. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no vibration, no scent. Just the vast empty space and me, standing alone. I felt a profound exhaustion settle upon me, heavier than any physical burden. My head throbbed, and a searing pain shot through my right arm, where the unseen tendril had touched me. I looked down. It was a brand, a mark. I had won, perhaps, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The entity was weakened, driven back, its immediate hold broken, but it was not destroyed. I had severed the conduit, yes, but not without absorbing a fragment of its essence, a shard of its ancient, hungry soul. When I finally stirred, the concourse had vanished. I had escaped its immediate grasp, but as I turned and walked away, not daring to look back, I knew